Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Fernando Carvajal, an expert on Yemen. But today we're not going to talk about the Houthis or the Middle East. Instead, we're going to go across the Red Sea into Africa, and we're going to talk about Sudan. Fernando, the war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces has been ongoing for almost 2 years. I think it began in April 2023. Can you briefly tell our audience what is this conflict about, what triggered it, and who are these two warring parties?
Thank you very much, Rohan. I appreciate you having me here. Definitely of concern. The conflict in Sudan is of concern to the entire region because it has prospects to spill over beyond the Red Sea and beyond the tri-border areas of Sudan. As you mentioned, this current civil war begins 2023 in April out of a power struggle within the council that eventually conducted the coup in 2021 after al-Bashir was deposed in 2019. So al-Burhan, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who spearheaded the coup in 2021 and today is both the commander of the Sudanese armed forces and the chairman of the Transitional Sovereign Council. It carries over from the Bashir era. I mean, this is the one thing that we have to keep in mind. This is the continuity of the power struggle since Bashir was disposed. Al-Hemeti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, was in partnership. He was part of the council in 2021. The Support Forces being a component of the military created by Bashir that continues, and it was separate from the army. But during the coup transition in 2021, it became part of that council after the coup. One of the major things that we see from this conflict between 2021 and 2023 was the power dynamic within the council and the military rule, which technically from the civil society perspective, this coup in this military council that included Islamist factions from the Bashir era was really a betrayal of the December revolution, right, which ultimately ousted Bashir. And civil society expected a transition into civil government, a transition that could lead to a democratic government that would do away with military rule and marginalize the military to merely their security role. But the coup of 2021, excuse me, the coup of 2021 definitely was a setback to these ambitions for these hopes. And now the war between the Transition Sovereign Council and the RSF further marginalizes civil society and raises the pessimism of an actual civilian-led government rising in Khartoum.
Right. So you basically said it's the two sides are fighting because they're aiming for legitimacy, they're aiming for control and power. But why has the fighting become so brutal, and how has it protracted in these 2 years?
Right. Sudan is a very complicated conflict, but because it's a highly complex society, right? It's tribal, it is sectarian. You have the regionalism playing a play, the east, the coast, the central, with Khartoum, Darfur, the southern sections, the mountains. And so a lot of the mainstream media and analysts simply focus on this war between the SAF, the Sudanese armed forces, and the RSF. But in reality, you have factions within each side, or even outside these two factions, the RSF and the SAF, that are pursuing their interest or protecting their interest, and some have gravitated to one side or the other. The remnants of the Islamist movement from Bashir is definitely a primary pillar, a vital pillar of the SAF, of the Transitional Sovereign Council. A lot of Sudanese analysts and Western observers really really credit the Islamist factions, the leaders of the Islamist movement, as really being behind the council, the Transitional Council. Whereas in the RSF, you have a faction that was marginalized by these Islamists, they would claim, that was marginalized by these Islamists. And this is why the Islamists are the primary voices against the current peace initiative, because they refuse to sit and legitimize the RSF, right? To the Islamists, the RSF is a paramilitary militia that should not be part of the peace process, right? So this is, you have the SAF and the RSF conflict, and then you have the Islamist RSF conflict. But also within Darfur, you have tribal factions that either defected from the RSF or were never part of the SAF, and now the SAF is courting them to multiply their numbers. The Islamist factions, for example, have created a number of militia that are fighting along the SAF troops, and many analysts, many Sudanese analysts, really credit them for being, excuse me, the strongest fighters against the RSF. And if we read the literature, if we read interviews by these Islamist military leaders, we see the narrative of jihad being utilized as well. So a lot of these Islamist leaders, whether it's the Shield Forces or the Al-Bara Brigade, they frame the fight against RSF and other factions in the south, for example, as jihad, as a continuity of jihad. So you see the rise of extremist elements within the SAF camp, and that then gives rise to other factions, like in the south, along the Nile and in the southern parts, coming out against the SAF and its allies. And then you also have the sectarian issue with the Christian population also expressing concerns over the impact of the war.
Right. Fernando, if you look at the map of Sudan, to the east is where the army is sitting, the Sudanese army armed forces. They have control of Port Sudan, so obviously they've got access to the Red Sea. Then to the west, you've got the Darfur region, where it's the RSF, but there are pockets of Islamist groups. And it's all come down to Khartoum, the capital. That's where the fighting has been the most intense. Now, both sides claim legitimacy. They both also claim control. But who really has the advantage on ground when it comes to not just Khartoum, but overall fighting in the region?
Right. So the RSF are working to consolidate their influence and their control over the Darfur area now that they've captured Al-Fashir a couple of weeks ago, trying to consolidate because there are a lot of factions in that area that are trying to gravitate toward SAF, or the SAF is trying to court them, with various incentives in order to increase the resistance against the RSF. There is no coincidence of why the SAF and the Transitional Council are in Port Sudan. This, as you pointed out, this is a highly strategic area along the coast. It gives the SAF direct access to the sea. It gives them two big airports, right, in Port Sudan and Khartoum now, because SAF control Khartoum since March of this year. Khartoum is really the base for all of these factions, not just the SAF, but all the Islamists are based in Port Sudan because they are able to move freely. They have more freedom from Port Sudan to move about the region and to receive. So I know the FO published one of my articles regarding the weapons, the flow of weapons. Port Sudan is the primary gateway for weapons to the SAF from Iran, for example, which it's a proven fact. We've seen warehousing complexes built in Sudan to house these. And I've written about the Houthis coming, and this is why it spills over. I've written about how the Houthis are trying to make a base in Port Sudan because it allows them to move about the region as well as expand their threat to the Red Sea. Right. And then this leaves the RSF with very small airports in the Darfur area for them to move around, for the leadership to move around, or for them to receive supplies from wherever they may be able to be receive them. The RSF definitely receives weapons from outside, and in order, otherwise it would not be able to sustain the fight against the SAF, etc. The strategic location for the strategic intent for the RSF is that the West borders so many other African countries, right, from Egypt all the way down to South Sudan to Chad, and then in the south with Ethiopia. That this is essential for the RSF strategically because it allows the RSF to present itself as a viable alternative for all these countries, Egypt, Libya, Chad, Ethiopia, in a friendly way, that they are not a threat to these other countries, that they threaten not, the crisis in Sudan is known as the UN has described the crisis in Sudan as the largest IDP crisis in the world, with 12 million internally displaced, an estimated 12 million internally displaced people, and with over 24 million people suffering and in need of humanitarian assistance. All of this has created a spillover. The conflict has spilled over into these countries because of the refugee crisis, right? So the RSF wants to control the West in order to convince these countries that they are not a threat and allow the refugees to return to Sudanese territory, right? And it wants to present itself or themselves as that option, whereas the SAF in Khartoum and Port Sudan are really not have the ability or the argument for this because they're so far from the borders.
Right. I want to talk about the external actors and geopolitical players later. I want to go deeper into what's happening in Darfur. The fighting has been the most brutal in the recent months. RSF say they've captured cities that were controlled by the Sudanese army. Sudanese army says they're on their way to rout the RSF from Darfur. What the media is saying, and especially global media, is saying that Darfur has deteriorated into what can be considered as one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. How bad is it really? What really is going on in Darfur?
Yeah, unfortunately, Darfur is a very large area, as you notice, in the west of Sudan, right? And the UN has been basically marginalized. We saw that the WFP chief, two main people from WFP, were designated persona non grata by the SAF, by Burhan's government. And we just saw, I believe it was Tuesday or Monday, we're talking the week of November 13. So this week you had a UN official visits Port Sudan Port Sudan, meaning visiting the Transitional Council in Burhan, in order to deal with that incident of the expulsion of WFP World Food Program officials, precisely because the UN keeps getting marginalized, further and further marginalized. At this point, the UN has no role in the peace process. That's a fact. They've been completely eliminated from the peace process, mainly because the Islamists have refused to deal with the UN. There's a big, long history of rejection on the part of Islamist factions against the UN. And so what we've seen, I just published an article this week regarding the attacks on UN humanitarian convoys, for example. So this is a big problem with the conflict in Darfur because there have been 3 or 4 major strikes on humanitarian aid project, and one side claims that these have been convoys transporting weapons for the RSF, and so the fog of war really seeps in through social media onto the mainstream media, and we don't really get the story straight. But when we look at the reports and track the timeline, the 3 areas where these convoys were hit were under control of the RSF. And in social media, we see social media activists praising those strikes as having hit weapons convoys. But then you have the UN agency reporting with issuing their own statements claiming that these were humanitarian convoys, right? And that humanitarian workers were killed. There were casualties among the humanitarian workers. So we do need to go beyond what we read in social media, and we do need to take a dive deeper beyond what the headlines in mainstream websites. Because even for me, when I write an article, I spend hours, following links and contacting people to get to the bottom line before I mention an incident or before I mention an actor. Sudan, again, it is, as you mentioned, the worst humanitarian assistance. Being from Yemen, I can tell you, 3 years ago, the UN considered Yemen the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Now, after 2024, after 2 years of fighting, Sudan unfortunately takes on that title, and with nearly half of the population, nearly half of Sudan's population is in need of humanitarian assistance, and most of it in Darfur. And that is a major axis. We've had, sorry that I interrupted you, but to the delivery of aid, one of the major issues for the UN has been the capacity to deliver aid. So when we look at Darfur and the mentioning of those countries bordering Western Darfur, the UN has to use those countries in order to transport humanitarian aid into Darfur by road. Some countries have provided humanitarian assistance by airdrops. The UAE conducted a few operations doing this, and then other Arab countries do it through Port Sudan.
It's ironic that Yemen makes it to the headlines. Houthis, of course, make the headlines, and somehow the global media sleeps on Sudan. There's not enough coverage. There's not enough discussion. There's definitely not enough analysis and deep down, I would say, dissections of why these fault lines have emerged. And I'm glad you're speaking to us about that. But I want to talk about the geopolitical actors. You've already mentioned a few. You've spoken about the UAE, Egypt, and it is very clear that they are taking sides. So what is really going on? Who is supporting whom in this conflict?
Definitely, we see the tectonic moving rapidly as the conflict progresses or deepens. There is a group called the Quad. I did mention that the UN has been marginalized in the peace process. So the Quad, which is the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. This is the Quad. These are the 4 countries that have taken upon themselves to engage both RSF and SAF to put out an initiative since September for a ceasefire, right, and to begin negotiations. Egypt, being the immediate neighbor and along the Red Sea, is now rising as a major influence. But just this last couple of weeks, they kind of made it clear that they're on the side of SAF, right? Because they're providing equipment, they're providing flight. There's been reports of a lot of flights into Port Sudan from Egypt. The government officials from Egypt have visited Port Sudan or interacted with Burhan's government. And so, there's some accusations that Egypt is providing intelligence or drone support, aerial support through drones for the SAF, particularly in Darfur.
Right.
And so Egypt is now posing this conflict as potentially threatening their territory, right? Earlier this fall, there were reports of a shipment of weapons that originated in Sudan and were stopped in Sinai. Interestingly enough, a lot of these weapons were linked back to the Houthis,
Mm.
trying to be smuggled into Gaza, for example. So this conflict is definitely complicating things for Egypt because not only is the conflict spilling over into its territory, but then it threatens to escalate conflict with Israel
Right.
at the time, right? Then we have Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, who are, for obvious reasons, major players in the region with major interests. Saudi Arabia sharing the Red Sea coast, right across the way from Sudan. The article that I wrote basically presents this scenario where the Houthis are expanding their influence in Port Sudan and along the east coast of Sudan in order to plan attacks along the Red Sea and potentially threaten Saudi territory because it's a lot closer to Jeddah and other
Right.
cities than Houthi territory in Yemen, for example. And so Saudi Arabia is very much aware of this, and Saudi Arabia really wants to settle this conflict in order to not create a vacuum that allows Iran and the Houthis increase their footprint and increase their threats, their military threats from Sudan.
Mm.
And so just recently we saw news reports that Saudi Arabia is lobbying the U.S. in order to get more involved, in order to hurry the process, to bring the parties to the table and reach a peace agreement. So, Saudi Arabia has also announced that they were hosting a former prime minister of Sudan now, and he is leading one of the major civil society organizations that is pushing for a peace process in Sudan. Interestingly enough, Saudi expelled a Sudanese Islamist leader in recent months because Saudi didn't want these leaders to be, using inflammatory rhetoric from Saudi territory, which would then drag the Saudis deeper into the
Right.
conflict. Then you have the U.S., of course. Unfortunately, this administration is chaotic. This administration is very inept at this conflict resolution, even though Trump paints himself as the peace president. We saw that he has fixed absolutely no conflicts in the world whatsoever. And you have the Secretary of State and the U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan and the Middle East, for Africa and the Middle East, trying to push for for a peace process that they wrote themselves, right? This initiative, this roadmap from September is a U.S. roadmap where the Quad agreed and other Arab states agreed
Mm-hmm.
to initiate the ceasefire peace agreements. But really, the U.S. are against the wall because they are being pressured by friendly governments of Trump, meaning Qatar and Turkey, which we know have overtly, reached out to Trump at the personal level. We have the plane, we have the weapons from Turkey purchases. We see Trump praising Erdogan and praising the Emir in Qatar. And so we see Turkey and Qatar sort of sneaking, they're not part of the Quad, but they're kind of injecting themselves, wanting a role because they're on the side of SAF. SAF, Burhan, announced in September a proposal from Doha that he doesn't want to recognize the Quad, and he's asking for Turkey and Qatar to be the primary mediators with RSF. Why? Because the Quad legitimizes the RSF too much, whereas Qatar and Turkey would minimize the legitimacy of RSF. And finally, we have the UAE, which obviously has its own political and security interest in the opposite side, right, of the peninsula, and it is injecting its influence on the side more so of the RSF, because number one, trying to curtail the influence of Islamist factions. Number two, because the UAE does have deep rooted interest in Africa, in stability, in business, in other relations. And again, the proxy war with the Houthis and Iran is alive in Sudan.
Right. So you've given us an amazing picture of what are happening, what are the things that are happening geopolitically in Sudan. But I want to get back to what's happening internally. Domestically, the country is almost breaking apart, or that's what it looks like. You spoke about 12 million internally displaced people. There are at least around between 4 to 5 million people, Sudanese, displaced outside the country as well. They're refugees. You've got about 90% of the hospitals completely non functional. There are famine conditions. Children are dying of hunger. Fernando, what do you think? Has Sudan as a state completely collapsed?
As a state, we can say so. I mean, we can frankly say so because of the inability to deliver, basic services. Right? We have the same issue in Yemen, whether it's Houthi controlled Yemen or the 8 areas under the legitimate government, complete collapse of the state, unable to pay salaries. The same scenario in Sudan, whether it's the Darfur area, Khartoum, or even Port Sudan. The money flows to the leadership, but it doesn't trickle down to the people. Yes, the fighting in Darfur over the last 6 or 8 months was terrible for civilians, but this is where the war spilled onto, right? After the fighting for Khartoum was completed in March, it spilled onto the south and into the west in Khartoum. And unfortunately, civilians bear the bulk of the war there.
Right.
There's definitely a need for the RSF. If the RSF now control this region, most in majority, then their priority should definitely be the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the delivery of government services to these people. They should secure the airport, secure the roads, and facilitate the flow of humanitarian assistance. This then becomes a security operation because, as I mentioned, the attacks on humanitarian assistance from the other side, this then becomes a security operation for the RSF because now they have to convince the UN that they are able to provide security in order to transport, whether it's by land or air, the humanitarian assistance for all these IDP camps and all these major urban centers, right? Population
Right.
centers in the Darfur, north, central, south areas. And so, one of the main priorities I've mentioned in my article for the US is before they expand the table for negotiations, before they bring in new actors, the US should um, pressure both parties to respect the flow of humanitarian assistance and to commit to providing security for these convoys and for the delivery for the UN. So hopefully, after this UN official leaves Port Sudan, he leaves with an agreement from the SAF and then an agreement from RSF to contribute to the security of the flow of weapons, the flow of humanitarian
Yeah.
assistance um, to the Darfur area. I will note that just recently, within a week or two ago of us speaking, the U.S. issued a statement saying that they may be willing to use force
Mhm.
in order to pressure the parties to come to the table. And one of the areas where this threat could materialize is in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So if the RSF and the SAF do not provide protection, security for this, then the international community might have to step in and provide security for the UN agencies.
Well, what do you think? What kind of action is the US talking about? Is it going to be airstrikes, or is there a possibility of boots on ground in Sudan?
I mean, the peace president, the peace president of the United States, we don't know what he's going to propose the next day or agree to. But the rational scenario would be peacekeepers, right? The entrance of UN peacekeepers in order to provide security and enforce a corridor, for example, a humanitarian corridor, be it from Libya, from Chad, from Egypt, that allows the secure transport of humanitarian assistance where it's most needed. Keep in mind that again, the UN has failed. It's beyond the failure in Yemen. The UN has failed over the last 2 years to gather the international community to donate. This year, donations toward the humanitarian relief requests from the UN have been abysmal. I mean, the UAE has donated a couple hundred million. The US is very low in the amounts donating. The European Union is near non-existent. And so the UN is suffering primarily from the lack of funds to pay its employees and to purchase humanitarian assistance. So this is one of those components of the crisis moving forward to alleviate the humanitarian assistance. Will the international community step up and donate in order for the UN to meet the needs in 2026?
Well, I think that still remains to be seen. But coming back to Sudan, in 2011, Sudan lost about a third of its territory when South Sudan broke away after decades of conflict. It's been 14 years since then. Fernando, do you see history repeating itself?
We hope not. I don't believe any of the major parties, whether it's the Islamist leadership from Bashir era, the SAF, or the RSF, I don't believe any of these major parties are interested in splitting up Sudan further, right? We hope that the Yemen scenario is not repeated in Sudan, where you have two de facto factions creating a de facto border, right? And complicating matters. We know that the peace initiative from the Quad is focused on a united Sudan based in Khartoum, etc. Bring its people together. Restart the discussion on the constitutional reform and the return of a civilian government or the establishment of a civilian government in the Khartoum. That is the goal of the Quad. That is the primary goal of the international community. It would not be in anyone's interest, with RSF, SAF, to split up the country. And it definitely is not in the interest of its neighbors and the interest of the West. So we hope that there is a peace initiative soon that definitely deters that narrative and definitely deters a fight toward that fracturing of the country.
Right. I think if there is a peace initiative like that where both the sides agree to speak to mediators who they're not picking themselves, as is the case with the Sudanese army, that would be a very interesting development. And I'll have to call you back to speak to us. On that note, thank you for speaking to Fair Observer Fernando and for giving your amazing insights on as to what's really going on in Sudan, who is fighting, and why the situation is so dire. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Fair Observer for the invitation. Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.